The summer heat in ancient Greece could kill a man even before battle began. Bronze armor turned warriors into walking ovens, and the dust kicked up by marching armies created clouds that choked the throat and burned the eyes. But this scorching day, in 371 BC, two forces prepared to clash in what would become one of history's most shocking military reversals. What happened next would shatter a military system that had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries. For generations, the very mention of Sparta struck terror into the hearts of enemies across the Mediterranean. These aren't just soldiers. When they were living weapons, forged through a system so brutal and comprehensive that it redefined what human beings could endure. Every aspect of Spartan society existed for one purpose: creating warriors who simply could not be defeated in battle. The Spartan military children could even walk. New machine began its work. Beforeborns were inspected by state officials who determined whether they possessed the physical qualities necessary for warrior training. Those deemed unfit were abandoned on mountainsides. Survival of the fittest wasn't just a concept in Sparta. It was state policy enforced with ruthless precision. At 7 years old, boys who had survived infancy were torn from their families and thrust into the agog, a modern military boot training system that makes camps look like gentle summer activities. These children learned that pain was an information, that hunger teacher, and that weakness was the only true enemy. They were beaten for showing fear, starved to teach resourcefulness, and forced to fight each other to develop the killer instinct that would define their adult lives. By the time a Spartan reached manhood and earned his place among the warriors, he had been transformed into something beyond ordinary human capabilities. He could march farther than any enemy, fight longer under impossible conditions, and maintain perfect discipline when other men would break and run. But individual excellence was only part of the equation that made Sparta unstoppable. The real genius of Spartan warfare lay in their perfection of the phalanx formation. Picture a moving wall of bronze shields, each overlapping with the next, creating an impenetrable barrier. Behind this shield wall, spear points protruded like the quills of some massive, deadly porcupine. When Spartan phalanx advanced, it moved with mechanical precision that defied human nature. Every step was synchronized, every movement calculated. Each warrior trusted his life completely to the man him. The besides psychological impact of facing a Spartan phalanx was devastating beyond measurement. Enemies would watch this bronze wall approaching and feel their courage drain away like water from a broken vessel. The sound alone was terrifying. Bronze armor clanking in perfect rhythm, war pipes playing haunting melodies that had preceded countless victories, the steady tramp of sandaled feet that never faltered, never wavered, never stopped coming forward. For 300 years, this system had proven unbeatable in pitched battle. 3 centuries of absolute tactical dominance. To put this achievement in perspective, consider that most empires barely last half that long before collapsing under their own weight or being conquered by rivals. The Roman Empire, for all its legendary power, maintained global dominance for perhaps 500 years. The British Empire ruled the seas for maybe 2 centuries at its peak. Yet Sparta's military supremacy had endured longer than most civilizations even existed. Everyone knew exactly how the Spartans won of their battles because they made no secret methods. Their tactics weren't hidden or behind walls of Essek dependent on surprise. The Spartan way of war was as predictable as sunrise and just as impossible to stop their elite. They placed troops, the royal guard, on the right flank of their formation, always, without exception. This wasn't arbitrary positioning based on tradition or superstition. It was cold, calculated military science. The mechanics of ancient Greek warfare created natural pressures that the Spartans had learned to weaponize. Every warrior carried his shield on his left arm, protecting his own left side, while also covering part of the man fighting beside him. This meant each soldier's right side remained vulnerable, protected only by his neighbor's shield. The result was a psychological tendency that affected every man in the phalanx. Battle-seeking warriors naturally wanted to drift rightward during the protection offered by the shield of the man next to them. Over the course of a fight, entire formations would gradually shift right, like plants growing towards sunlight. The Spartans had turned this human weakness into their greatest weapon. Their right flank, packed with their most elite warriors and naturally drifting rightward, would inevitably overlap the enemy's left flank. Then came the hammer blow. The Spartan elite would wheel inward, attacking the enemy from the side and rear, while the rest of their phalanx held the front. It was mathematical. Every precision applied to human destruction commander in Greece understood this tactic was coming. Every army had attempted to develop counters to this devastating maneuver. None had succeeded. You could reinforce your own right flank to match Sparta's elite concentration. But then you were pitting your best troops against their best, and Sparta's finest were simply superior. You could try to break through their center before their right flank could complete its encirclement, but you would never move fast enough. Spartan discipline in the center was unbreakable. You could attempt their depth to match and concentration, but no other city-state possessed enough elite warriors to create a formation of equivalent quality. It was military checkmate executed with bronze and blood. The only way to avoid defeat was to avoid fighting Sparta in open battle entirely. Smart enemies retreated behind city walls and hoped the Spartans would grow bored and leave. But eventually, circumstances would force a confrontation, and when that happened, the outcome was never in doubt. Now shift your perspective to the other side of the battlefield, where the Theban coalition was experiencing what could only be described as collective despair. These men knew they were marching toward their own destruction. Thebes had been living under Sparta's iron fist for years, ever since Athens had lost the great war that determined who would rule Greece. Sparta, drunk on victory and power, had begun interfering in the internal affairs of other cities, installing puppet governments and maintaining occupation forces where they had no legal right to be. Thebes had suffered particular humiliation when Spartan troops seized their Acropolis through treachery. Duringabans had recently thrown peacetime. The Tiash off this yoke through a desperate nighttime coup, assassinating the Spartan-backed oligarchs and driving out the occupation garrison. But everyone knew Sparta would not tolerate such defiance. They were coming with a full army to crush Theban independence permanently, and this would be no mercy time there. The numbers told the story of impending disaster. The Theban coalition could field perhaps 6,000 infantry. The Spartans approached with 10,000, 7 including 100 full Spartan citizens, whose individual combat value was worth multiple ordinary soldiers. Worse still, the Theban allies were present more from fear of Sparta than confidence in Theban leadership. At the first sign of defeat, half the coalition would likely switch sides or simply flee the battlefield. In the Theban ranks, men were making peace with their gods and settling final accounts with fate. This felt like a suicide mission wrapped in the thin pretense of a military campaign. Any rational commander would have avoided this battle entirely, retreating to fortified positions and forcing the Spartans to pay a bloody price for every mile of territory. But retreat would mean abandoning their allies to Spartan vengeance and accepting power that had already permanent subordination to have proven its willingness to crush any sign of independence. Standing before this impossible situation was a Theban general named Epaminondas, and he was looking at the approaching Spartan army with eyes that saw something no one else could perceive. Where others saw a fundamental weakness, a hidden defeat, Epaminondas recognized within Sparta's greatest strength. The very perfection of their system had become their prison. They had spent 3 centuries refining their tactics until they achieved mechanical flawlessness. But that flawlessness had made them rigid, predictable, unable to adapt when someone dared to break the rules they had written in bronze. The spar blood, and of war a Sumerton Wade symmetry. It assumed enemies would deploy their forces conventionally because that was what intelligent commanders did. It assumed opponents would attempt to defend against the inevitable right flank assault because that was obviously the correct response. But what if you didn't play by those assumptions? What if you deliberately chose to do what every military manual said was suicide orders? Epaminondas gave that morning must have sounded like the ravings of a madman. He right-stripped his flank down to a skeleton force to maintain the appearance, barely enough men, of a battle line. Then he gave these troops instructions that violated every principle of warfare. They were to refuse combat entirely, pulling back and avoiding contact with the advancing Spartans for as long as possible. He was voluntarily surrendering territory to an enemy whose entire tactical system depended on that rightward drift and overlapping maneuver. His officers must have thought their general had suffered some kind of breakdown. You don't give ground to Sparta. You don't allow their elite troops to maneuver freely across terrain you're supposed to be defending. That was tactical suicide disguised as strategy. Then came the truly revolutionary part of his plan. Epaminondas took every reliable unit he possessed, every veteran warrior, every elite soldier who could be trusted to hold formation under the most extreme pressure imaginable, and concentrated them all on his left flank. Not in the traditional 12-rank depth that had defined phalanx warfare, but 50 since its inception ranks deep. 50 men pushing behind each warrior in the front line. To understand the audacity of this decision, consider that normal phalanx formations relied on 12 men providing support and momentum to those fighting in front. Epaminondas was creating a human battering ram with more than 4 times the standard pushing power. He was sacrificing width for depth, flexibility for concentrated mass, tactical options for a single overwhelming blow aimed directly at the strongest point of the Spartan line. This wisdom that violated fundamental military had guided warfare for generations. You don't attack the enemy's strength with your own strength, because that creates a grinding of attrition. Battle and attrition always awes the larger fave army. Smart commanders find weak points, create advantages clever through maneuvering, exploit gaps. In enemy formations, they don't simply ram their best troops into the enemy's best troops and hope the superior numbers make that difference, but was exactly what Epaminondas planned to do. Leading this unprecedented concentration of force would be the most unusual military unit in the ancient world. 300 warriors arranged in 100 and sacred 50 pairs. Thed band of Thebes. And these weren't just any partnerships. They were pairs of male bound together lovers by emotional ties that transcended normal military discipline. Before dismissing this as some ancient curiosity, understand brutal logic behind this arrangement. The Thebans had observed something that modern military psychologists would later confirm through scientific study. Soldiers fight hardest when their protecting man might someone they deeply care about. A retreat to save his own life when the battle turns against him. He might abandon his position if the cause seems hopeless. But he will never run if doing so means the person he loves most will die. He will never surrender if his beloved is fighting beside him, depending on him for survival. The sacred band fought with a desperation that was qualitatively different from ordinary military courage. They weren't motivated by abstract concepts like honor or duty to the state. They were fighting to keep their lovers alive. Each pair functioned as a micro-unit, covering each other's weaknesses, anticipating each other's movements with the intuition that comes only from intimate knowledge of another person's rhythms and reactions. Where the Spartans had individual excellence backed by systematic discipline, the sacred band possessed something harder to quantify but equally powerful. Emotional bonds that made them fight like cornered animals protecting their mates. They would take wounds that should have been fatal and keep fighting. They would hold positions that should have been abandoned. They would charge into situations where survival seemed impossible, because survival without their partnerless was meaning gambling. Epaminondas was everything on a single throw of the dice. His entire battle plan depended on that 50-deep column of Boeotian troops, Theban An, spearheaded by the Sacred Band, smashing completely deliberately weakened army rest of his through the Spartan elite, collapsed under pressure before the... If his concentrated attack failed to break through, the Theban coalition would be destroyed piecemeal. If it succeeded, the world would witness something that hadn't happened in living memory. King Cleombrotus looked across the battlefield at the Theban formation and saw exactly what he expected to see: an army that didn't understand the fundamentals of proper warfare. Their line appeared crooked, asymmetrical, almost amateurish in its construction. Their right flank was already pulling back before combat had even begun. Were these Thebans so terrified they were retreating before the battle started? Their left flank was bunched up in that strange, deep column that looked more like a mob than a military formation. To a Spartan commander who had won every engagement by following proven methods, this looked like an opponent who fundamentally misunderstood how warfare operated. The Thebans appeared to be making every mistake simultaneously. Cleombrotus wasn't concerned. He was contemptuous. These Thebans were about to receive an education in why you don't challenge Sparta in open battle. They would learn what 3 centuries of other enemies had learned. Spartan military science was perfect, proven, unbeatable. He gave the order that had preceded so many victories. The Spartan army advanced, their war pipes playing that haunting, rhythmic melody that had become the soundtrack to Greek nightmares. The right flank, packed with the royal guard and the finest Spartan warriors, moved forward with terrifying discipline. Each step synchronized, each man maintaining perfect formation, the bronze wall approaching like an avalanche of death. The Theban right flank continued its withdrawal, their own pipes playing slow and mournful as they backed away from contact. The Spartans on the right advanced into increasingly empty space. What was happening here? Were the Thebans refusing battle entirely? Was their left flank going to attempt some kind of desperate attack while their right wing abandoned the field? Then the Sacred Band at the head of that monstrous 50-deep column began their advance, and everything changed. They didn't spread out to match the Spartan frontage like any rational formation would. They stayed compressed, a human spear point aimed with surgical precision at a single section of the enemy line. The Sacred Band was moving at double time, covering ground with frightening speed, building momentum that would soon become unstoppable force-meeting, immovable object. The Spartans in the Royal Guard sector watched this approaching column and adjusted their shields, set their spears at the proper angle. They had absorbed charges before. Countless enemies had tried to break their line through brute force. All had failed. They were ready for another routine demonstration of Spartan superiority. They were not ready for what actually hit them. When that Theban column collided with the Spartan line, it wasn't combat in any traditional sense. It was physics applied to human flesh. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The front rank of Spartans had 12 men pushing behind them, providing momentum and support. The front rank of Thebans had 50 men pushing behind them, creating pressure that defied human endurance. Imagine standing in that front Spartan rank. You've braced yourself properly, shield positioned at the correct angle, spear ready to thrust. You've done this hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in actual battle. You understand exactly how to absorb an enemy charge, how to distribute the impact across your formation, how to hold your ground against superior numbers. Then 50 men's worth of concentrated force hits your shield all at once. Not gradually building pressure that you can adjust to, but instantaneous, overwhelming impact that your body simply cannot withstand. Your feet lose traction on ground that seemed solid moments before. Your shield arm, strengthened by years of training, buckles under pressure that exceeds human limits. The men behind you are pushing forward, trying to provide support, but they cannot match the force being applied from the other direction. You're being driven backward, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. If you fall, you're dead. not necessarily from enemy weapons, though those are certainly present, but from being trampled by the press of bodies behind you. Your own comrades, unable to halt their backward momentum, will crush you underfoot. The human body has absolute limits, and those limits were being exceeded on a massive scale. The Spartan front ranks didn't break because they lacked courage. They broke because physics doesn't negotiate with bravery. They were being literally crushed by superior mass, concentrated at a single decisive point. The bronze shields that had protected them in countless battles became instruments of their own destruction as the pressure forced them back against their own bodies. Into this chaos came the sacred band, fighting with a fury that transcended normal battlefield aggression. These weren't professional soldiers executing tactical maneuvers. These were lovers protecting their beloved partners from death. Each pair operated as a killing machine, refined by emotional bonds that no military training could replicate. When one warrior's spear thrust missed its target, his partner was already moving to cover the gap. When one took a wound that would have incapacitated a normal soldier, the other went berserk with protective rage. They weren't trying to hold a defensive position or achieve some abstract tactical objective. They were driving forward with singular purpose, punching through toward the Spartan king himself. And nothing in their universe mattered except reaching that target. The intensity was inhuman, relentless, powered by emotions that made death preferable to failure. The Spartan Royal Guard represented the absolute pinnacle of military excellence. These were men who had trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. They had faced desperate enemies before, survived impossible odds, held their ground when lesser troops would have shattered. They fought with tenacity that should have broken any normal attack, displaying the kind of disciplined courage that had made Sparta legendary. But this wasn't a normal attack. The pressure was beyond human endurance, applied with mechanical precision that made resistance futile. Men in the front ranks were being crushed against their own shields, unable to breathe properly, unable to see clearly through the press of bodies, simply trying to remain upright, while dozens of warriors pushed from behind. The wounded couldn't retreat because there was no space to fall back. They died where they stood or were trampled when they collapsed. Still, the Theban column pushed forward, inch by bloody inch, step by agonizing step. They were driving the Spartan elite backward. For the first time in living memory, the invincible Spartan right flank wasn't advancing into enemy territory. It wasn't even maintaining its position. It was retreating under pressure that seemed to come from another world entirely. Then someone in the sacred band, history never recorded his name, managed to get his spear point through a gap in the shield wall and found King Cleombrotus. The cry that went up when the king fell changed everything on that battlefield. It wasn't just tactical information being communicated, it was the shattering of a cosmic assumption. In Spartan culture, kings were more than military commanders. They were descendants of Heracles, touched by divine favor, living symbols of Spartan invincibility. They led from the front precisely because their presence was supposed to guarantee victory. Kings didn't fall in battle except in the most extraordinary circumstances, and when they did, it meant the gods themselves had withdrawn their protection. The Spartan Royal Guard went absolutely berserk, but not with fear or panic. They erupted with rage and desperate determination that transcended normal human emotion. They weren't fighting for tactical advantage anymore. They weren't even fighting for their own survival. They were fighting to recover their king's body, because allowing the Thebans to capture it, parade it through their cities, desecrate it in victory celebrations, was unthinkable. That would be a stain on Spartan honor that could never be washed away. They got him. At horrific cost, sacrificing dozens of their finest warriors, they managed to pull Cleombrotus's corpse back into their own lines. It was an act of incredible bravery and incredible strategic stupidity. Because while the absolute best soldiers in the Spartan army were dying to recover a dead body, the rest of their forces were watching this disaster unfold. The Spartan Phalanx wasn't composed entirely of elite Spartan citizens. That core of 700 full citizens was surrounded by thousands of perioetae, free non-citizens who lived in Spartan territory, plus representatives from allied cities who fought for Sparta out of legal obligation rather than fanatical devotion. These men had joined this campaign expecting to witness another routine Spartan victory. Instead, they watched the royal guard getting slaughtered. They saw their supposedly invincible king fall to enemy spears. They observed that Theban column continuing its relentless advance despite taking massive casualties of its own. And they performed the calculation that every soldier makes when defeat becomes inevitable. What are my chances if I stay versus my chances if I run? The collapse started slowly, then accelerated with frightening speed. A few men at the rear of the formation began edging away from the combat zone. Then a dozen. Then 100. The Spartan center and left flank, which hadn't even made contact with enemy forces yet, simply dissolved as panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. This was the moment Epaminondas had engineered with such brilliant precision. His withdrawn right flank hadn't just been avoiding combat. It had been a psychological weapon, drawing the Spartan right wing so far forward in pursuit that they became dangerously separated from their center. When the center broke under the pressure of watching their elite getting destroyed, there was no one left to support the troops still locked in desperate combat with the Theban column. The rout became a massacre that would echo through the ages. Thousands of men threw away their shields, that sacred symbol of Spartan honor that mothers told their sons to return with or upon. The bronze discs that had protected generations of warriors became abandoned debris scattered across the blood-soaked earth as panicked soldiers fled for their lives. The disciplined phalanx formations that had marched onto the field that morning transformed into a terrified mob streaming away from the battlefield in complete disorder. For the Thebans and their allies, this was catharsis 3 centuries in the making. Every man on that field carried memories of Spartan arrogance, Spartan cruelty, Spartan occupation. The Helots and Perioeci fighting in Spartan ranks had suffered even worse. They had been enslaved and subjugated by these same Spartan citizens who were now running like frightened rabbits. There would be no mercy today. The fleeing Spartans were cut down as they ran, hunted through the fields like wild animals, killed when they begged for quarter. The Boeotians weren't simply winning a military engagement. They were exercising generations of accumulated humiliation and rage. Every blow struck was payment for years of bondage. Every Spartan death was justice for countless acts of oppression. Meanwhile, the Spartan royal guard had completed their grim mission. They possessed the king's body, but they found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. The Theban column had finally halted its advance, having achieved its primary objective of breaking through the elite core. The survivors of the royal guard, perhaps 300 men from the 700 Spartiates who had begun the battle in that sector, discovered themselves in a pocket of sudden, eerie silence. Around them, their entire army had evaporated like morning mist. The Theban forces, victorious and still relatively intact, were now turning their attention to these isolated survivors. The Spartans were completely surrounded, outnumbered 10 to 1, exhausted from the most brutal hand-to-hand combat any of them had ever experienced. They faced a choice that violated everything they had been taught since childhood. Spartan law was absolute in its clarity: victory or death. A Spartan warrior returns with his shield or carried upon it. Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was impossible. You fought where you stood until you achieved victory or died in the attempt. These principles had been drilled into them through decades of conditioning that began before they could properly walk. But the commander of the survivors, a polemarch named Dercyllidas, looked around at his remaining men and recognized something that changed the fundamental equation. These weren't just soldiers whose individual deaths would be tragic but militarily acceptable. They represented the genetic core of Sparta itself. Over 400 Spartiates were already dead on this field. Another 300 stood here, surrounded by enemies. If they made the traditional, glorious last stand, Sparta would lose almost its entire citizen body in a single afternoon. The demographics were catastrophic in ways that transcended immediate military concerns. Sparta's population of full citizens had been declining for generations due to their impossibly strict requirements for citizenship. You had to be born to 2 Spartan parents. You had to survive the agoge. You had to contribute to the communal mess system. The numbers were already dangerously low before this battle began. Losing 700 citizens in one day would be a demographic disaster from which Sparta might never recover. Annihilated made a calculation that no Spartan commander had ever been forced to make before this moment. Better the shame of survival than the complete extinction of Sparta as a functioning state. The decision required him to violate every principle he had been raised to consider sacred, but the alternative was watching his people disappear from history entirely. A herald emerged from the circle of bronze shields, unarmed, carrying the staff that marked him as an official messenger. He walked across the corpse-strewn battlefield, stepping over the bodies of friends and comrades, picking his way through pools of blood that reflected the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. His destination was the Theban lines, and his message was devastatingly simple. We request a truce to recover our dead. In Greek military culture, this phrase carried unambiguous meaning. It was a formal admission of total defeat wrapped in diplomatic language. You only asked to recover your dead if you had lost the battle so completely that you could no longer hold the field. It was surrender in everything but name, a public acknowledgement that the enemy had achieved complete victory. Epaminondas could have rejected this request. He possessed every right to demand unconditional surrender or order one final charge to eliminate the survivors entirely. Nobody would have criticized him for such a decision. These were the same Spartans who had occupied the Cadmea, interfered in Theban politics for years, treated Thebes as a subordinate state subject to Spartan whims whenever it suited their interests. But Epaminondas understood something far more sophisticated and strategically brilliant. Killing these survivors would transform them into martyrs, another Thermopylae that would inspire Spartan vengeance for generations to come. Songs would immortalize their heroic sacrifice. Children would learn their names. The legend of Spartan invincibility would actually grow stronger through a glorious death. Letting them live, however, forcing them to formally admit defeat, making them gather their dead under the contemptuous eyes of their conquerors, sending them home bearing the unbearable weight of failure that would inflict a wound that could never heal, that would break something fundamental in the Spartan soul that no amount of military training could repair. He granted the truce. What followed was perhaps the most psychologically devastating moment in Spartan military history. The surviving warriors began the most humiliating task imaginable: walking among the dead, identifying the corpses of their friends and brothers, lifting them onto shields that now served as improvised stretchers. Every body they recovered was evidence of their catastrophic failure. Every step was a journey deeper into dishonor that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The Battle of Leuctra had accomplished something that seemed impossible just hours earlier. It had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility in a single afternoon. The military system that had dominated Greece for 3 centuries lay broken on a blood-soaked field, destroyed not by superior numbers or advanced technology, but by tactical innovation that exploited the very assumptions upon which Spartan warfare was built. Epaminondas had proven that even the most perfect system contains the seeds of its own destruction. The Spartan way of war had become so refined, so mechanically precise, that it had lost the ability to adapt when someone dared to break the rules. Their greatest strength, absolute tactical consistency, had become their fatal weakness when faced with an enemy who refused to play by established conventions. The secret weapon that annihilated the Spartan Phalanx wasn't superior equipment or overwhelming numbers. It was revolutionary thinking applied to military science. It was the willingness to question assumptions that everyone else accepted as unchangeable laws of warfare. It was the courage to sacrifice everything on a single bold gamble that defied 3 centuries of military wisdom. In one summer afternoon, the world changed. Sparta would never again march onto a battlefield with the certainty of victory. Their enemies would never again flee at the mere sight of Spartan bronze. The balance of power in Greece had shifted permanently, and the age of Spartan dominance was over. Sometimes the mightiest fortresses fall not to prolonged siege, but to a single crack that brings down the entire structure.